So, tonight, what we're going to be looking at in our liturgy course, this is number 22. I did think about doing weddings and funerals together, but there's actually too much material to do both of those things together. So we're going to do funerals next week, a little bit closer to Holy Week, so perhaps that will be quite a good thing as Easter approaches. And tonight we're going to do weddings, liturgy and weddings. So I'm going to do a little introduction to the topic, and then Joyce is going to take over and tell us a little bit about the history of weddings. There. So I'm going to start talking about weddings in general, and then Joyce is going to take over and talk a little bit about the history of weddings. What we're going to try and discover this evening, really, is the answer to several questions and try and figure out what we're doing when we celebrate weddings, say, in churches. Why do churches get involved in weddings at all? Here are two traditional wedding cakes, a sort of English-American one on the left-hand side and perhaps a French one on the right-hand side. They're more or less, maybe they look a little different from that. So what are weddings for? We may think we know the answer to this question. That is, to get two people hitched, basically, and that's the end of the story. But we're going to discover that there's a little bit more to weddings than that. Secondly, why do churches get involved in weddings? They haven't always been involved in weddings, as we're going to discover, but at one time it was de rigueur for everybody to get married in church. Now, not quite so much, but still a church wedding is considered to be an important and solemn thing. What are the elements of a wedding service? What goes into a wedding service? What bits do you need to make a wedding service work in a Christian context very specifically? And if you're planning a wedding service, how do you plan a good wedding? What are you going to do to make sure that the liturgy that you use in a Christian wedding service is going to be a good liturgy and it will accomplish what you set out to do? Now, as we can see from these few slides, weddings as a religious concept are not confined to one particular tradition. Here you can see a Muslim liturgy for a wedding. In the next picture along, you can see the end of a Jewish liturgy for a wedding with the smashing of the wine glass under the huppah after the relevant prayers and blessings have been said. Here you can see a Hindu ritual for a wedding. Some of these traditions in other religious traditions can be extremely complicated, very detailed, have their own specific things that happen, and if you miss one or two of them out, you're going to end up not having a legitimate wedding by the end of the day. So now we've sort of looked at it in a very general way, I'm going to hand over to Joris, who's going to talk a little bit to us about the history of Christian weddings. Do you want to move in a little bit? I'll move over here.
So, as Nigel just walked us through like different rituals in different faith traditions, wedding is deeply interpersonal and deeply familial, deeply social, deeply cultural, deeply political too, and religious, because religion is not separate from any of the things I've mentioned before. So these forms of traditions have always been imbued with a sense of religiosity, because religiosity is about relationship. So the Christian churches did not invent the ceremonial of weddings. The ceremonial recognition, if you want, of the union between two individuals, which was also recognition of the union between two families, sometimes two countries, if you're royal. So it's never understood in most cultures until quite recently as the union of individuals on psychological terms of like mutual love, on romantic terms. So traditionally, the Christian church just took on what already existed culturally in terms of practices, as we will see in the Roman Empire, which was the area in which the Christianity developed at the beginning. So as it happened that way, we can legitimately question these connections that have been made and have been really as form our Christian understanding of wedding, which is very culturally defined by Roman law, by a certain understanding of a contract between two individuals who have to be men and women and who have to be in a monogamous relationship. And we'll see that it's a quite more complex question if you have a look at different cultures too. Some which are actually represented in the Hebrew Bible. So traditionally the wedding, which exists in many cultures, and I would say all cultures in some form, is the foundation of a new household. So it's kind of a spreading of a new creation of a new nucleus, a new family that is a new household that's going to emerge from this new conjunction of two human beings. So the household can have a lot of different shapes. It can be a monogamous, it can be polygamous, it can involve multiple men, multiple women. There are some certain cultures where there is polyandry, that is one woman has multiple husbands and they don't always live in the family. The organization of family is so diverse and really is a good example of the diversity of human relationship throughout history and throughout cultures and throughout religions too. So tonight we're going to have a look especially at the birth, growth, and evolutions of Christian weddings. So in the first centuries, that is like 100 from after Christ, marriage was not understood on Christian terms specifically. The followers of Christ could get married in the traditional way of their cultures, as there is a very early Christian letter, which is a letter, letter to Dagnetus. That's a very early Christian text that dates to 130, that says Christians do not differ from any other men or women in country or languages or custom, and is especially talking about the way Christian can get married, for instance, following the rituals of their culture, as long as it's not opposed to the Christian faith. That is, you don't want to have a sacrifice to a local god in your Christian wedding. Or you don't want to see a soothsayer, as was also part of the Roman traditional wedding, to see. Usually the soothsayer would say everything is going to be well, of course. But you don't want to have that if you want to prepare and discuss with your wedding planner how your Christian wedding is going to be in the first century. So in the Mediterranean world in which Christianity developed, the major judicial reference was the Roman law. That is, the society was organized, and people could have their relationship acknowledged through a very precise code, an organization, which was the Roman law. That is the law that came and developed in Rome and then was spread throughout the whole Roman Empire. So in Roman law, a marriage is defined as a consensus. That's a mutual consent of the spouse. This mutual consent makes the marriage valid. So you cannot really be engaged in a marriage with someone who is not consents to the wedding to a certain extent. Of course, the consent is not based always on an individual consent, as much as it is the father who also gives the bride and all of this. But a marriage, to be acknowledged, has to be between people who are free. Otherwise, it's a form of a concubinage. So it required a few conditions, such as proper age. You cannot marry under a certain age or above a certain age that could be frowned upon. Permission from the parents, very important. You see so many plays in the ancient times that play with all of this. The father doesn't want the son to be married, so they find tricks to have them married. A lot of Roman plays are all about it, Plautus and all of this. And another aspect too is the absence of impediments created by kinship. You cannot marry people who are too close to you in terms of relationship, or affinity sometimes, or civil law. That is, if you have a very special partnership with someone on legal terms, you cannot always get married with them. So the ceremony was thus optional. It was more a way of celebrating this union and really making it a big deal because it's a social event. So if you want a marriage to actually mean anything, it has to involve people. Otherwise, it's not just a recognition by a state, because the state doesn't exist in a very procedural and organized way. It doesn't give you a tax benefit not to get married. You see, so marriage is first of all a social, a political thing that's happening to you. It's also gathering different wealth. It has a social impact before having a legalistic impact, or something that you as an individual will benefit from, or your couple. So the ceremony was really a way of sealing this union, and the ceremony would usually include a family meal, during which the fiancé, the man, gave to the young girl a ring and sometimes a kiss. There's a whole set of traditions that were involved at that time with the use of a veil too, so the veiling of the future of the bride or both spouse. So there was a lot of ritual in ancient Rome and around the Mediterranean, which was a way of celebrating these weddings. You see it also in the Hebrew Bible to a certain extent. There are texts that recall weddings, or in the New Testament with the wedding of Cana. So we often think of the Romans as usually like kind of morally loose, but actually family values and a form of strict moralism was quite popular in the Roman Empire, and especially in the elites at the early time of Christianity. So it was not like Christianity came and set everything into order after the Romans were unruly and not being involved in some form of monogamous or contractual relationships. So the Roman conception of marriage is actually quite strictly monogamous. It's very different from other cultures around the Mediterranean basin, like in the East, for instance, where there were some form of like polygamy, for instance. So it was also oriented in this very kind of militaristic Roman republican understanding of it towards the production of legitimate offspring, which was a way of continuing your legacy and continuing the republic and then the empire, and really continuing the good values of the ancestors too. So it's always bound to these very traditional values that are the values of the Roman Empire and the values of the elite, the Roman elite. So this, as I mentioned quickly, it was very different, and we're going to come back to it soon, from a lot of other cultural practices that people were totally aware of, and also like other forms of relationships that were also very common, just like prostitutions or different forms of concubinage. How would you say concubinage?
Concubinage.
Concubinage.
Yes.
That would also exist. So the Hebrew Bible, for instance, has many witnesses of other forms of relationships that are not defined or understood on these very strict contractual marital terms, just like the stories of Abraham, who has two wives, or Solomon, as we will see, who had many wives and many concubines. So until the Peace of Constantine in 313, the Christian only experienced the rites of marriage within the family and within this kind of cultural set by slightly adapting it to their Christian faith, but it was not really understood as a deep Christian commitment as it might be today in certain Christian circles, like evangelical circles especially, or Roman Catholic too, or any form of actually quite a mainline Christian denominations. So they would just follow the customs, probably not even thinking about it really as like an adaptation or making it purposely Christian, just so they would just refrain from the polytheistic parts of the ceremony, as I mentioned. So the church accepted, as we saw, the legal framework of Roman law, but put some restrictions to it, like the prohibition of divorce that was really possible in Roman law. It quite happened many times. Many emperors also divorced, and all of this happened. It was totally possible to divorce in the Roman law, and the church said no, basing it on some form of theological reflection about the union of Christ and the church and other texts. So people would sometimes ask, in the first centuries, the advice of a bishop to marry fellow Christians, but there's actually no evidence before the 4th century of the existence of a liturgical blessing or the participation of a priest in marriage rites. So until the 4th century, really, there's not a lot of witness to the specificity of a Christian wedding, although it was something like ceremonies around wedding existed in Jewish traditions too, existed in all cultures, you see, but it was not shaped or scripturalized in Christian as a part of the Christian faith, the Christian way, something that would distinguish it from the rest of all the type of unions you could have.
And I suppose by the 4th century, there were lots of documents around Christian letters, Christian treaties, Christian commentaries on the Bible. And if there was some sort of ceremony or procedure, it surely would have survived in the ample material that survives from that period.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really not the main, but it doesn't mean, that's an interesting thing, it doesn't mean that people didn't relate in their wedding also and related it to their belonging to the body of Christ. Some letters of Paul that are attributed to Paul, as we will see, talk about wedding, and wedding is also part of Hebrew scripture. Wedding, or like union between two individuals, intimate union between two individuals, was also part of the Hebrew Bible and the reflection and texts that are present in it. So it doesn't mean that it was altogether discarded, but it was not understood as a specific value or crystallized on Christian theology and terms. So in the starting in the 4th century, though, there was this development of crystallization of a form of Christian understanding of wedding or union. Here you see on this slide a sarcophagus. We're going to see a couple of sarcophagi that are from the Museum of the Vatican. And all of them, you'll see, are quite similar. You have this depiction of the couple in the middle, and surrounding them, you have a lot of stories from the Bible. You can probably recognize a couple of them. Just above the couple is actually Adam and Eve around the tree. The little children. Let come to me the little children. Isaac.
Yes. That looks
And
like
Abraham.
Isaac and Abraham. Yeah.
Is it the colonne de fumée?
The fumée.
Or a sacrifice of some sort?
Yeah.
So if you look in the detail, you'll see that all of these sculptures are actually stories from the Bible surrounding the couple on their sarcophagus, where they're sleeping forever together. So So, however, like despite the fact that the Christians at that time were basically just doing traditional, customary form of unions, it was clear that Christians who got married thought about their lives and lived them in Christian way, which means that they had a Christian understanding of their union. The union with their spouse, just like the union with other brothers and sisters, was in Christ. And that's the letter of Paul I just mentioned here. Paul. It's attributed to Paul, but it's probably not from Paul. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church, without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. And later, this is a profound mystery, but I am talking about Christ and the church. However, each one of you also must love his wife, and he loves himself, as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. So you see how there's this weaving together of the Christian tradition, the biblical traditions, and the revelation of Christ with this substrate, these traditions that are really customary of being married and being associated with one particular person. So maybe we can go back to the beautiful sarcophagi. So you see the one before here. So you see these two are really depicting this union of stories. You have the story of the couple, just like in the letter from attributed to Paul. You have the story of the couple, then they're here, but they're surrounded by the biblical stories. So the stories are woven together. It's never the union of the human beings who are being married is never here on their own. It's always surrounded by the rest. And that's quite beautiful because it's really woven into the story. This is a sarcophagus that's a bit... I couldn't find any scholarship that studied it in depth. It says sarcophagus of two brothers. As you see, it's actually doing exactly the same thing as this matrimonial sarcophagus. So I've read an article online that says that can be a same-sex couple, or that it was just used for this purpose, and it's doing exactly the same thing with the Christian stories surrounding it. You see. So yeah, that would be interesting to see if there are some possible other interpretations of this sarcophagus.
It's like Daniel in the lion's den.
Yes, it is.
Here.
Yeah.
Sure, what else we can see? It's interesting. Could this be Thingamy and the sycamore tree? Zacchaeus was a little man.
The
blessing
healing
of the children, or the healing of
the child.
that's
definitely Isaac and Abraham.
Yes, up at the top here.
Yeah, the healing of one of the women.
Yes.
So you see, all of these sarcophagi are really weaving them together. So even before we started to know about the liturgy, because we don't have any proof of any liturgy of that period, there is the idea that the life and death and resurrection of a couple or two brothers is linked to the whole Christian story. So you're not just linked individually to the Christian story, but you're linked because you belong to a family, because you belong to a family, basically, if these are two brothers or if it's just a couple, or we don't know. So you see this So when the liturgy of marriage developed after the peace of the church, so in 313, it developed on the base of the secular customs, which were reinterpreted in Christian terms. Here you can see it. You see thousands of sarcophagi like this, which don't have the same type of Christians haut relief or bas relief. So it was mass production too, but you can have it sorted to your traditions too. So you see, just the artwork itself tells about how things are really inscribed in a specific culture and is adapted. The tradition of haut relief sarcophagus with pictures of other family members or gods and things is adapted for the Christian stories, just like the tradition of marriage of the Roman law is adapted for the sake of the Christian faith. So in all the traditional practices, like the blessing given by the father to his daughter, was understood as a visible expression of Christ's blessing, for instance, even more so when a priest or a bishop was invited to the ceremony. So that's how also people started to have the priest or bishop giving the blessing, because it became such a social festival that you would have also the person who have the more authority in your local community that would also be in charge of this job, you see. So it didn't come first as an idea, it came first in terms of practice, and practice shaped the liturgy as always. So in Rome and Milan, Christian marriage continued the Roman tradition of having the spouse veiled during the ceremony. Here you see is it Hera? Is it
I think it probably is, yes. It's a veiled Roman lady.
Yeah, a veiled Roman lady. Very common for women in good standing to be veiled in Rome. If you have virtue, you should be veiled. Otherwise, you're kind of a loose woman. So the early Roman liturgy talks only of the bride, and the rite is centered around her. So it's quite interesting, because you also think, if you think of like the role of women as a exchange material between families, also as Lévi-Strauss has showed that women were exchanged as one of the gift that sealed unions too. So a lot of the early Roman and Roman Christian rites were centered around women. I guess it's a bit like today, like even today the bride has still kind of the most expensive dress at the wedding, and it's kind of still the center of attention. Like when you have a royal wedding, nobody really cares about what Prince William was wearing, but everything was about the lace that Kate Middleton, right,
yes, yeah.
had, that was made by X and Y and in France, I think, but it's not the matter really. So the blessing of the church in the early forms of the liturgy paints the picture of a Christian wife. So it's really the text of the liturgies, the early liturgies, talks about her and reminds the stories of holy women of the Old Testament, who are really set as models for early Christian wives. There's also remembered the marriage of Christ and the church. So all this old tradition of interpretation of the Bible as and the Christian revelation as being a marriage between Christ and the whole people. It also early Christian tradition also asks the grace of fruitfulness for the new marital life. So it's also equating it in a very strange way to the new life of baptism. But in that case, what is being recognized by the whole community and brought to Christ is not an individual, but a union, a relationship. So the nuptial blessing was traditionally given during Mass in the early 5th century, during Mass before the peace and the kiss of peace, which the celebrant gave to the husband, and then the husband to the wife. I don't know if it was on the mouth or not. Could be, because actually it was quite traditional in many cultures to kiss on the mouth without any sexual understanding of it, really. So you see how it really wove into the tradition, the secular traditions, polytheistic tradition, and have them kind of wove them into the liturgy so that it derives, or at least it pretends to derive its power from God, from Christ, from the peace that Christ gave to the world. So it's kind of a baptism of the traditional, customary way of getting married. So the wedding was integrated as really a part of the liturgy at the time, and a bit like we did, for instance, with some form of blessings. When we did the blessing for candle mass, for instance, of candles, you could bless your candles too. It was part of the liturgy. It goes back to your home. You have a nice relationship with this candle, but it's not something that's really set. It's kind of a paraliturgical. It's in the liturgy, but it's also leading to some form of other forms of life, devotional life for your candles, and a form of devotion to in marital life. That's not strictly church oriented. So the readings during the ceremony, the early liturgies, would be New Testament passages that mention the imagery of the bride, or the wedding, like the wedding at Cana. So this type of liturgical blessing was prescribed actually in the early church for clerics. It was offered, so it was kind of optional too, just like in Roman law, the publicity of the wedding is kind of optional. And it was offered to lay persons, but it was also refused to Christians who were, so to speak, fornicators or entering in a second marriage. But you actually see that also a lot of powerful Christians could actually get to marriages. Some early kings of France had 2 marriages or kind of concubines. And so when we're talking about all the how you get married, we have to be always mindful of the difference in social statuses, the difference in where you are in the church. Are you in Rome? Are you in a little church mission in Ireland? Things are quite different, you see, wherever you're located. And the rites are also very different. And until very late in the history of Christian liturgy, the rites of marriage were really, really depended on where you were. So that also asks questions for us today, like how much do we want the liturgy of marriage to be universal, or should we also listen to how the Spirit is talking in our different contexts? This rite, the rite that I just described with the bride, which was inherited from the Roman tradition, spread because of the importance of the Church of Rome throughout the Roman Empire, and in Gaul and in Spain. But in these places, there were also other traditions that existed. In France, for instance, in the 5th century, the wedding would consist of a blessing by the bishop in the bridal chamber. And the wedding was really understood as a betrothal and an exchange of gifts between families and spouses. So like rings, you would exchange dowry. All of this was part of really the political and social exchange that was happening in a wedding. Now, in the East, things were also very different. And when we go into detail to later on how it evolved later in the West, we'll see it. In the East, instead of veiling the spouse, like it was happening in Rome, here you see on the statue still, a tradition in the East was to crown them, and it still exists today. Here you see, I had to take a screenshot of a wedding ceremony, Orthodox ceremony. So the bishop or priest would put the crowns on the heads of, here, on the bride and the bridegroom. And just like in the West, starting around the 4th century, wedding became more and more liturgical and progressively moved from a private setting to a church setting. The tradition, the text and the rites of the liturgy developed really also, just like in the West, by putting together biblical references, and more biblical references got stacked on each other and related So the gestures also started to become meaningful. That's how the liturgy develops. How you have all these different elements that come together and play during the liturgy. And so it was, for instance, one of them is what you see on this actual picture, is the tradition of having a little dance performed by the spouse, the newlywed, and the clergy. And you see some members of the family, I think, here. Yes. Yeah. And so you can look up videos if you're interested. There's a special song that is sung about Isaiah. And it's performed around the gospel. So people dance around the gospel. So you see how, in a very interesting way, it really managed to weave together the Christian tradition and the couple, really include the couple inside the Christian community, but by keeping at its center the gospel and the traditions of the church, not making it kind of a stage for our little psychological selves who want acknowledgement in front of all the family and friends or the whole nation in certain cases. So in the West, later, so after the 5th, 6th, 7th century, contrary to the East, the liturgical form of the wedding evolved a lot in the 2nd millennium. So you see, like what you see here in the East is probably quite similar to what happened in the 1st millennium. But in the West, things evolved a lot. So in the 1200s, marriage became in the West a ceremony celebrated immediately before Mass, but just in front of the church. So you remember in Gaul, especially in Britain, in Northern Europe, you would still have the wedding in the chamber or kind of in a private setting. But because people say, and some of the synod, the minutes from the synod show, because of the instability and maybe the violence that was also exerted on women, or the fact that some people may not be consenting to be married, wedding had to be, priests were encouraged and were actually demanded to perform a public wedding. That is a wedding where the spouse, and especially the women, we could be sure that women give free consent to the wedding. It was not some form of like sexual slave or some form of obscure union, you see. So they insisted, a lot of synods in the 12th century, 10th century, insisted that the priest must make a prior investigation, for instance, of the consent. Of course, the consent is not always individual consent, but at least consent of families. And as a consequence, marriage became more ecclesiastical. And theologians at that time also started to count marriage as one of the sacraments, while they still maintained that it was kind of solely dependent on the consent of the couple. So it doesn't need, they had to hold together the fact that it didn't need really formalities or publicity, and at the same time that the church really wanted to have it public. So there was this tension for a certain while in Christian history, in the first half of the 2nd millennium, basically, about the church pushing to have it public, and at the same time the fact that it was kind of inherited from Roman law and that it really didn't need to be acknowledged by the church as such. That's how you also come to see a lot of people who were not really sure how they were married, and there were not records at that time, and it was kind of still understood in this very social way rather than really a sacrament, you see. That's really in the first 500 years of the 2nd millennium that things started to move towards being more formal and more Christian and more centered around the figure of the priest who is bestowing and really acknowledging and joining together the two persons. So the authority of the priest is really becomes center, and the church setting also becomes center to the Christian wedding in the medieval period. And as a matter of fact, as it became a sacrament, yeah, this picture is beautiful because it's really showing it. You see the priest, or the second one. The priest is joining the hands of the women and the man together. So in order to make it as public as possible, a couple of synods required that it happened in front of the church and no longer in the bride's room, the bridal chamber. The exchanging of vows by the spouse was sealed by the sacramental words of the priest, ego coniugo vos, I join you. And you see how ego coniugo vos, I join you, is also kind of a development on the baptisal, ego baptizo. So it became quite a form of scripturalization, a continuation, a development on the sacrament of baptism. But here it was understood as a relationship that was being acknowledged by the church. So as I mentioned, there were a lot of different traditions around a marriage. And the church really didn't try to erase any of them until the modern times, really the 18th century. Even in the 19th century, there was a lot of diversity in the ceremonies, even in Western Europe, in different regions. And so the church didn't really try to erase it, and certain dioceses are also specific rites and liturgies for weddings that were not really understood as a problem. So, for instance, until the 19th century in France, in rural France especially, couples will still be married under a veil. Here, you're not in a rural setting at all, I think. It looks quite urban, actually, on this engraving. So they will still be married under a veil, so the tradition was called velatio nuptialis in Latin, but it had a lot of different names depending on the regions. And so if the couple, also that's quite a lovely tradition, if the couple already had children, so if they had anticipated it a little bit, they could still be legitimized by placing them two under the canopy. So you see that at that moment, in a certain understanding, wedding is still understood as the union to build a family. It's not a recognition of individual so much, or psychological love or romantic love. It's still really a social standard. It's something that's building up the community, because the family is also the basis of all communal life in traditional societies. So in the liturgy and the history of the church, now I'm going to talk a bit more broadly about what we've seen. Christian marriage developed on the base of cultural practices and biblical references. And that's really by the interweaving of the two that the contemporary liturgies of marriage came about. Now, what's really interesting about that is that what you choose to keep in or to leave out of this nexus of connection that is happening in a liturgy really allows the church to define a certain understanding of the union of the persons. That is, it imbues a certain legitimacy to a social standard, which is the union of persons, by giving it the legitimacy of scriptural references by gestures that are hinting to the biblical tradition. So you see how the connection you choose to make really give power and transfer some of the power of the church, some of the religious power, to a union which in certain cultures or in pre-Christian cultures was not understood as Christian, or was not understood on these terms. So what about same-sex unions, for instance, or polyamorous or polygamous unions? Could these connections also be made? There are a lot of texts in the Bible that have polyamorous or at least polygamous, polygenic relations. Why connections are not made there and are made with other texts? You see? So whenever we study the history and development of the liturgy, just like any form of human development, it's enshrined, it's really encrusted in human relations and how they've been shaped by the cultures in which they have developed. In our case, it's really been shaped by Roman law, as we saw, or the traditions around the Mediterranean Sea. And maybe if Christianity develops in other settings that are not so culturally defined by these standards, maybe it would take different shapes. Just like the whole of the Christian theology, for instance, has been really heavily defined by Greek thought. If you think of Christian theology in China on Confucian terms, things may look differently. And it might be the same for Christian weddings. And actually the reality of weddings today in countries we have traditions of polygamy, for instance, in Africa or other settings, shows that it can be more complex than that, and you can make other connections. One of the biblical connections used in the liturgy are really interesting to look at, because they are critical places of investigation. They are critical places because it might not be so obvious that the Bible is upholding a very monogamous, a very contractual, a very bourgeois, if you want to say, understanding of wedding, of marriage too. One of the most traditional texts to refer to the love in marriage is the Song of Songs. You've probably heard, and you can see a lot of evangelical thing using it and all of this, and this lovely love story between the bride and the bridegroom. But you also have to be really aware of the fact that translating is treason to a large extent. And whenever you choose to translate a bridegroom and a bride, it's inferring that you have this already lenses that you're reading the text with. And the Hebrew text doesn't use all this baggage and doesn't have all this baggage of very post-Roman understanding of wedding. And in this text, the Song of Songs is also attributed in the tradition to Solomon, one of the kings of Israel who built the temple, and he was really revered for his wisdom. So he's not very bad character in the Hebrew Bible. But Solomon in the Bible is also said to have 700 wives and 300 concubines. So to which of them did he write the Song of Songs? Here's a very Orientalist depiction of the visit of the Queen of Sheba to the King Solomon, the Queen of Sheba who returned to according to certain tradition, to Ethiopia. And I think she had in some traditions say she had some children from Solomon too. So to whom did he write the Song of Songs if we believe the tradition itself, you see? So what you choose in the tradition, you always select the connections you want to make and you want to use to uphold a certain liturgy or certain theology, especially when it has to do with human relationships and the power some institutions and some people can exert on others by the use of these very liturgies. And so it's worth thinking about that, I think, to see that things are not as obvious as we think. So the liturgical use, reading, and translation of the Song of Songs makes it about a monogamous relationship, if you want. But paradoxically, perhaps, in the traditional rite of marriage, the Song of Solomon ends up symbolizing a contracted marital relationship oriented toward reproduction, but that's not really what the text is interested in telling, and that's not what the text is saying. It's a text, really, it's one of the only texts in the Bible that's really woven into the whole of the corpus, but it's interested in a form of like hedonistic enjoyment of the pleasures of physical love and of the spiritual values of this enjoyment. So it's not a text. If you read it again, you'll see it doesn't talk about wedding. It's not really interested in that. And if it does, it's peripheral with the women, the Old Jerusalem. But the enjoyment, you see, is not oriented toward this form of really conventional bourgeois 19th century, if you want, or post-Roman understanding of what a wedding is. So I think it's always worth to expand our understanding of the tradition by realizing that they're really set in context. Similarly, the reading at a wedding, which often happens, or we saw in the tradition it also happened, of the story of the wedding at Cana is an interesting one, because it obscures what the text is actually doing. The text doesn't talk about the spouse, it doesn't care really about the spouse. Well, at least that's what we thought if we read it at the beginning, because you think, well, the wedding seems to be a setting, just like on this beautiful painting by Veronese, where you see like there's a whole party going on, a lot of people, but where are the spouse? Where are they? Can you see them? No. Well, not really, but you can see who is in the center, though.
Jesus.
Yes.
Jesus.
Yes. So the whole story, and actually the painting of Veronese really shows it, the spouse in this story, for the biblical tradition, because of all the references it gives to other biblical texts like Genesis and the creation of Adam and Eve and the tree. All of this hints of the fact that Jesus and Mary are the two figures of the spouse in this story. And if you reread it, you will see that it's not about the wedding of two other people to which Jesus would have been invited with his mom, but it's about the mystical union, also the mystical relationship between Jesus, Mary, is called, how it's all types of the story of Adam and Eve, and in the end, and the whole purpose of this story is to show the redemption at play of all humanity, not just the celebration of this wedding of two persons. So a lot of readings of biblical texts in the context of a wedding liturgy obscures the texts, and obscures what the gospel is telling us. Another good example of that is 1 Corinthians 13, with all the reading of well, Nigel, you can quote it in English by heart, probably.
So, the faith, hope, and love abide, these three, but the greatest of these is love.
Yes, well, this understanding of love also, that really makes it all about the love of the couple, whereas in the text of Paul, it's not about this very psychological, interpersonal understanding inside a couple. So you see how there are pros and cons about being married, and there are pros and cons about the liturgy of marriage too, and how it has developed and be understood, because it's really enshrined in a certain cultural understanding, and has upheld a certain set of values that have not been always positive, of course. And making wedding liturgies is far from a neutral enterprise. It has keeping social and conventional values to a certain extent. And that's the reason why also early Christians, we learn from Paul, for instance, were not invited to think much about being married at all, because the kingdom of God was coming, so there was better business to do. Voilà, that's all that I had on Christian.
Thanks, Joyce. That's really fun and interesting. You reminded me towards the end there of that little famous rhyme that goes, Solomon and David lived complicated lives. They always spent the afternoon with other people's wives. But when in the evening their conscience gave them qualms, one wrote the Proverbs and the other wrote the Psalms. So yes, certainly far from. And it's interesting how those passages are still read in modern conventional marriages. So as we've seen so far, the history of marrying people in church is really a very embroiled one, and it reveals a sort of multitude of motivations and strata of cultural interpretations, and how the secular relationships are interpreted and sort of jumbled into the way the church goes about things. Here's the thing. People have very specific ideas about what they expect from a wedding liturgy. And sometimes their expectations are really very seriously at odds with what the church thinks it's doing when it's celebrating a liturgy. Because they're bringing into the church very secular ideas of what an ideal relationship should look like. And the church may not see things in that way. As we've just heard from Joris, those readings that people choose can be interpreted in a multitude of ways. And also, there are a bunch of other readings that are not chosen that may throw a very different light on what relationships are about and what you're doing when you bless them or consecrate them or whatever it is that you're going to do when you get into the church. Now, with certain very notable exceptions, I have to say, I've never really enjoyed presiding at the liturgy for weddings with people I don't know. I'd prefer to do their funerals for a bunch of reasons. They're more interesting and more fun. If I don't know the people who are getting married, it's always a little bit tricky. And in fact, I'm not sure that churches really should be in the business of marrying people at all, in some ways. I know that's a controversial opinion. And in the United States and in the UK, the minister of religion, or the clerk in holy orders, as you can see from the top of this little official form, can perform both the legal part of the ceremony and the religious part of the ceremony. So in other words, if you are a clerk in holy orders, you are doing two things. You're presiding at a legal secular ceremony that the authority of the state has been given to you to carry out, and you're performing a religious function. So you can see here, this little form has to be filled out. A similar form is filled out here in the United States. You've got the parish church, this is in the county of Oxfordshire. They have to send out these little forms to show ministers exactly what they're supposed to be doing. It has to be done in black ink because black ink has a date tracer on it. It's all manufactured with a date tracer, so you can't forge the documents. It has to be done with a special pen. You've got to see the banns have been announced. How old are they? It says condition, single, previous marriage or previous marriage dissolved. It used to say bachelor or spinster. It gives you the rank or profession of this person. The residence at the time of marriage. It gives you the father's name and surname and the mother's name and surname, and what their profession of their father was on these marriage certificates. So it's a little spooky that a minister of religion has to oversee all of this rather secular business before waving their hand over the couple to bless them in holy matrimony. Now, this is a problem for these reasons, I think. First of all sorts of people come to churches to be married, let me tell you. That's absolutely fine, but you've got to work out why they've come to you. What are their motivations? Why do they want to get married in a church? You have to do that because perhaps you want to personalize the liturgy. You want to have them hear something of God's voice to them, something of God's love to them. I mean, that's easy to do if they're already members of the congregation, but it's much harder to do if they're complete strangers, or sometimes, even worse, strangely enough, members of your own family. You've got to ask them deeply religious questions that might make you feel rather uncomfortable if it's your brother or your cousin or somebody or other who's asked you to marry them in churches. Secondly, weddings are terribly time-consuming. They're going to involve pre-meetings for marriage preparation, meetings to discuss the liturgy, the actual service that we're going to talk about in a minute. They're going to involve a rehearsal with this concomitant rehearsal dinner in the United States. The wedding itself, then, the wedding reception, the filling out of forms for the church and the city. And so what ends up happening is this. All the trappings of the event threaten to overwhelm whatever liturgy you've crafted. And the liturgy itself ends up being something to be endured or sort of gotten over with. So that the real business of the speeches and the food and the drinking and the dancing can start. Also, here you go, here's an example of this. Poor Patricia and Richard, I don't know who these people are, but I found it on the internet. Luckily their telephone number isn't there. This is a 4-day wedding you've got here. You've got rehearsal in Faith and Hope Church. That's a good place to start, I suppose, Hope. Rehearsal dinner at a restaurant and a groomsman tea time. Is that, I suppose that's a golf thing maybe? On Friday, the bridesmaids luncheon, arrive at church, wedding ceremony 7:30, half an hour and it's all over. The rest of the 4 days are spent playing golf, eating, brunching, picnicking, bikes, bites and brews tour, Chicago pizza tour, and a grand finale of a brunch on Sunday morning when everybody has slept over their hangover at 11 o'clock. So you can see at the heart of this is my poor little liturgy at 7:30 that I've spent, 5 hours trying to craft personally for a couple sometimes that I don't even know. So people's tensions are also running very high at weddings. They want some sort of perfect occasion. They've employed other people to help. The worst of these people, I'm sorry to say, are the wedding planners and the photographers. They say, can you move that? Here you go. Meaning the cross. It's in the way of my photos. Can you take it away somewhere else? They use flash photography when you're trying to read the vows out for them, so it flashes in your eyes and you can't read anything anymore. And you're trying to achieve this sort of intimate and solemn moment. So here you've got another example. Here's a wedding photographer and a bunch of other people who are busy taking photographs. The minister's been forgotten at the back here. He's no longer important. It's all over. The tension's gone, so no point in turning around to him or asking him how he's going to get out of the church, for instance, or get undressed and whether or not he's wanted for the photographs that take longer than the ceremony itself. And here this man is right in the way of the procession coming out of the church. The couple are probably more interested in a decent photograph than leaving the church with a modicum of dignity as a married couple. Sorry. There's my grouse for the day. In fact, there was a little expression amongst English clergy. You would say that person has got as much liturgical sense as a wedding photographer, meaning no liturgical sense at all. If you're going to run a wedding as a minister, incidentally, you've got to treat these people very firmly. If a wedding is in your church, you are in charge of the liturgy. Your word is the rule. If they want a church wedding, they want a church wedding. It's not a backdrop. It's a sacred space, and a liturgy happens within it. So wedding preparation meetings, we're not really going to concentrate today on the preparation before a wedding in terms of the chats about the sanctity of marriage and the raising of children, or what sort of sex you have, or what your attitudes are towards money, although it's always recommended that you chat about those things to any couple. I normally just ask them how they met, how their families and friends feel about the marriage, why they want to have a wedding in church. I might even ask them about weddings that they've attended in the past, what they liked, what they didn't like. Because I'm in a mixed marriage myself, that is with an American person, I can ask questions of couples from different backgrounds about that, and whose answers are going to tell me a lot about the sort of liturgy that they're going to like. or a lot about the sort of thing that their family and friends are going to think if they do something horrendous that another culture doesn't really like. If you're using the traditional service in the Book of Common Prayer or something, things are going to be fairly straightforward. And what I'm going to do is close the slideshow just for a moment. We'll come back to this in a second. And I'm going to walk us through the actual liturgy itself of a wedding. You're going to have to sort of get them to fill in all sorts of forms. There's a lot of complicated names that you have to get right. People want to be called their full name or just a fraction of it. If they were baptized with their full name, it's a good idea to use the full name at some point in the service before you get on with it. First of all, you get these opening remarks here. This is the beginning of the service. The prayer book is very coy about it. It says, at the time appointed, which normally means half an hour late, the persons to be married with their witnesses assemble in the church or some other appropriate place. We'll come back to that word assemble in a minute, because this is going to tell us a lot about what the liturgy is for and how people get to where they're supposed to be. So, at the very beginning, I'm going to give some opening remarks that are going to tell you exactly what the liturgy is about. What's going to happen here? We're going to place what's going to happen in context. And we're going to reassure people also who are there, they might not be churchgoers at all, we're going to reassure them that this is what we're in for. This is what the liturgy is about today. There's also sort of a little illumination of the symbolism of the rite. And I tell you another thing that this does, people get overexcited. This is a way to calm everybody down before the liturgy starts. They're going to induce this sort of reverential attitude. So I'm not going to say, dearly beloved, we've come together in the presence of God. Isn't this a big joke, actually? I know you all want to get out there and have a good drink and take some decent photos and have a dance. I'm going to say, dearly beloved, we have come together in the presence of God to witness and bless the joining together of this man and this woman. If that's what they want, that's what they're going to get. So here you can see this covenant of marriage established by God in creation. It's a very traditional thing in the Book of Common Prayer here. Adorned this manner of life by his presence and first miracle at a wedding in Cana of Galilee. Just what Joris has been talking about, a very specific reading of the texts that says that this was about, the text is primarily about a monogamous traditional marriage celebrated here by us too. So here you go, it sort of goes on to describe exactly what it's for. We'll come back to this in a minute. The union of husband and wife in heart, body and soul is intended to be this, that and the other. And then I have to say, these two people have come together for this reason. And a solemn moment is to say, if you can tell me why this should not happen, you should declare it. In other words, this is taking place in a public place. It's important that the liturgy happens in a place that's accessible to the people, because Christian teaching around marriage, that goes for most denominations, is that a wedding is not just between two people. A wedding symbolizes and embodies a whole lot more than that, in terms of trust, in terms of its symbolism about God's relationship with God's people, which is why you want to make sure that there's nobody around who's going to say, well, actually they're brother and sister. That would be illegal, but maybe not against church teaching under certain circumstances. I think it is at the moment. They're married before. They've got 2 other wives somewhere, or 3 other husbands or something. And in the olden days, it used to be if one of them was actually a man when they were claiming to be a woman. But that's no longer an obstacle, at least in the Episcopal Church. It would be presumably still in many other denominations. So then I have to ask them as well whether they know any reason why that should not happen. Now, here's another thing that Joris was just talking about. When weddings became something other than a private matter in the bride's bedchamber and became a public matter in front of the people, you want to make sure that neither of the parties has been coerced into this situation. So I am going to ask both the bride and the groom whether or not they consent to what is about to happen. And you will notice here that the celebrant says to the woman first, not to the man. At the moment, the person who is giving her away is holding on to her arm, and interestingly enough, is holding on to her right arm so that his right arm is free to grab his sword. The tradition was that the person giving the bride away hands the hand of the bride-to-be into the hand of the minister, so that the minister can look into the bride's eyes, and if she looks panicked or says, just shakes her head or something, the minister can snatch her into the sanctuary where nobody can reach her. It's an old tradition. I don't know if it's still observed, but it's certainly part of that. Maybe it would be considered to be part of the patriarchy nowadays. And then the woman has to answer, I will.
Or not.
Or not. Yes, quite. Then the same question is asked to the husband. And then I turn to the people and say, will you, who are witnessing the promises, do all in your power to uphold these people? So you can see the heart of the liturgy of a wedding is the notion of promise and mutual support, even if it's in a secular situation. What does the church do with promise and mutual support? They set it within the contexts of God's relationship to God's people. That's what makes it a Christian marriage. Not the fact that these people are making promises to each other, though that's important, nor the fact that the people are making promises to support them in their married life, but we are looking towards the people who are being married to give us a parable in some way of God's relationship with the church and Christ's redeeming love for the body of Christ, which is the church. Now that's happened, we come to something called the ministry of the word. This is the collect, this is the readings from the Bible, any other source they like. Very often, people are going to ask for readings that they know, like 1 Corinthians 13, or something from the Song of Solomon. But they might not be familiar with these other passages in the Bible that we were just mentioning here that might fit a liturgy for them better. Liturgy between two people of different cultural backgrounds, for instance, might enjoy a passage from the book of Ruth, where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. There are many other passages in the Bible that speak of love and intimacy and commitment to life outside their own private marriage that might suit them better. And it's the minister's job to craft a liturgy that reflects that, because people will look to that couple and think, yes, I've never read the passage of the Bible like that before. That's really instructed me in something or shown something to me physically between these two people that I've not thought of. Or the marriage of a much older person with a much younger person. There are passages in the Bible that you might choose for that too. Ruth, absolutely, that speak of the same sort of love that knows no age when it happens, just as God's love knows no age for the young or the old. So when you're crafting a liturgy around these things, this is what you might be thinking of. And that raises an interesting question. Is the liturgy supposed to be personal? Or is it something abstract? And a liturgy around marriage, if it works really well, is going to fold those two things together. Because the personal is the godly, and the godly is the personal. And the marriage liturgy should be imbued with that sort of interrelationship between those things, to expand our way of looking at the relationship that is about to be blessed. Something to add there, Joyce?
No, no. I think it's...
Then we come to the vows. Here's some of the passages that are suggested. All a little predictable, perhaps, but still. Here are the vows. There are certain liturgical symbolisms within the marriage. For instance, the man facing the woman takes her right hand in his. So, the man makes the promise first. So the woman offers her hand palm upwards, and the man takes the woman palm downwards. Can you see that happening? So the woman is going to hold out her hands as if she was receiving something in them, and the man is going to take the woman's hand in his hands. And then says, in the name of God, I, Billy, take you, Doreen, to be my wife, or whoever they are. And then they loose hands, see? They loose their hands, and the woman takes the man's right hand in hers. So then the man offers his hands to the woman, and the woman takes the man's hand. Now, these vows are liturgically extremely clear and very concise. They're going to remind people of the extent of God's love for God's people. Look, imagine it's God saying this to you. I take you to be my spouse, to have and to hold, for better, for worse, no matter what happens to you. Whether you're rich or poor, whether you're sick or healthy, I'll be there to love and to cherish. So these vows are evoking God's promises to us. We are the spouse of Christ. That's why these vows have been so carefully and so concisely written. And that's why I'm really cautious about letting people compose their own vows. I am really not interested in where they first met at this point. I'm not even interested in learning about how one of the spouses wants to learn to like ice skating, or wants to sort of develop a love for hiking in the woods. None of these things interest us in these vows. These are very personal things, and they're nothing to do with the vows that people are supposed to be making in churches. Then comes the blessing and exchange of a ring or rings. In the olden days, there used to just be one ring that was given to the wife, but now often there are two rings that are exchanged. This is another complicated point in the proceedings for a whole bunch of reasons. Very often people mistake the rings. I'll come back to what can go wrong with all of that in a minute. And then comes, at the end of that, the declaration of marriage. So you can see that the liturgy is quite tightly arranged. Now they've given themselves to each other with vows, they've joined their hands, they've given and receiving rings. I pronounce that they're husband and wife in the name of those whom God has joined together, let no one put asunder. Now, once we're over that, we come to the prayers. Now, what are the prayers that we use for a wedding? Sorry, I think it's that. There we go. The prayers are supposed to reinforce what the liturgy has already done. The fact that the liturgy highlights the sort of religious and social responsibilities and repercussions of the promises that the couple have actually made to each other, to support each other like God supports the church, to raise children together if that's God's will, to develop a relationship that includes and embraces other people, that isn't exclusive and elitist and private and demeans single people. The prayers are supposed to reflect that. And as you can see, they do. Give them wisdom in ordering their life. so that they can be a strength in a time of need, and a counsellor in perplexity, and a comfort in sorrow, a companion in joy. This is what we expect from a relationship with God, too. Knit together in your will, your spirit, that they can grow in love and peace with you and one another. Here's a little bit about forgiveness and pardon. Give them grace when they hurt each other to recognise and acknowledge their fault. So the prayers are also make their life together a sign of Christ's love to the sinful and broken world, that they may overcome estrangement and heal guilt, and joy can conquer despair. That they reach out in love and concern for others. So the whole liturgy here isn't centred on a personal satisfaction business. It's much more about the couple becoming a focus for a moment of God's relationship with God's people. Not that single people can't do that either. Everybody is able to do that, each in a vocation and in a ministry. And then eventually here comes the nuptial blessing, the traditional nuptial blessing at the end of the service. There are two forms of it. And then all of the people are blessed. And if there's a Eucharist, we go on to do the peace. Now, I'm going to take this screen away, and I'm going to take us back for a minute to our PowerPoint presentation and resume from the current slide. Here are a few practical considerations that I think are going to help us to understand what liturgy is a little bit more clearly. First of all, when it comes to putting any liturgy together, there are certain things that you've got to bear in mind. And weddings are a really useful example of this because they're complicated for a variety of reasons. First of all, how are they going to get into that position that you can see here? This is not, a Star Trek-y thing where they just get beamed into place. You have to get them there. You have to get them in the right order. This is the groom's side. This is the bride's side of the church. Here you've got the groomsmen lined up in a sort of uppy-downy order, and the bridesmaids lined up in a rather more sloping line, although the matron of honour is slightly shorter than the first bridesmaid here. You've got to get them in that position, and you've got to rehearse this wretched thing. How many processions do they want? Have these people processed into church neatly? Have these people processed into church in any way? Or have they just popped in there? What music do they want? Because choosing hymns is going to be something we'll discuss at another evening. But here in weddings, it's quite important, because ideally the hymns should reflect the flow of the liturgy, actually. It shouldn't just be something everybody knows. Oh, we know Amazing Grace, let's have that. But is that very suitable for a wedding? I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. Through many dangers, toils and snares, it might produce a few giggles in the congregation. You don't choose hymns simply because everybody knows them. It's good if everybody can sing them, but too bad. Sometimes those hymns can be a little bit cliché. Sometimes they can be off, as I've just said, and more of that in a minute when I discuss what can go wrong in these liturgies. Next, is anybody giving one of the spouses away? And how are they going to do that? This is a bit of a controversial one. This is Prince Charles and Meghan here. There was some sort of kerfuffle about Meghan's father, wasn't there? I seem to remember in the news. So the question was, who's going to give her away? And the groom's father walked up the aisle with her and gave her away. So you've got to sort of figure out how that's going to happen and when it's going to happen, or even if they want it to happen, because nowadays women or men don't want to be given away. Who gives this woman to be married to this man? Or who gives these people to be married to each other? Traditionally, what happens at that point is that the veil is thrown back, the bride's father gives her a kiss and abandons her at the altar to her fate. Do they want to write their own vows? God forbid. I always say, bad idea. I've sat through some really bad ones and really bulletin crumpling moments. How many rings are they going to have? And who's going to get them? And how are they going to be found? Here we've got two ring bearers who've got them on cushions with a complicated knot, probably, so that the best man won't be able to extract them, and they're going to have to be stuck on the finger of the groom and the bride with the cushions still attached to the rings. So you've got to figure all of that out. Do you want me to say when they're married, you may kiss the groom or you may kiss the bride? Do you want anybody special mentioned in the prayers? Somebody who's died, a parent or a godparent, or somebody who is sort of instrumental in bringing you up? And how are you going to leave the altar? What's going to happen? How are you going to get back? Now, a quick word about wedding rehearsals. This is clearly a wedding rehearsal, and it's probably an American one. Here you have the father of the bride, and apparently it's a tradition to make a bouquet out of tatty bits of nonsense so that you can rehearse not with the real flowers that you're using on the day. I don't think, and we're still talking about liturgy here, because liturgy is complicated to put together. I don't think I've ever done a wedding rehearsal that's gone perfectly. And I think this is because I'm pretty much the only one in that room, unless there's a priest being married or something, who has a vague professional understanding of what it takes to produce a liturgy that looks effortless and natural. Nothing at these wedding rehearsals is too obvious not to need mentioning. How are you going to walk without looking stupid? How fast is that going to be? How are you going to stand? Will you be there with your hands in your pockets or something? You've got to have people conscious of a liturgical space to pull a liturgy off for a whole bunch of reasons. Also, these wedding rehearsals can rapidly degenerate into some sort of chimpanzee's tea party. And if the families that you're marrying have never met each other before, you're going to be the one, as the person who's presiding at the liturgy, to pull it all together. You might even have to make introductions. Somebody is going to discover that they have a long-lost interest in etchings or something, and they're going to want to talk and do social grooming at the time that has been set aside for the wedding rehearsal, and you're going to have to say, shut up, sit down, and do what I tell you. I've got a whistle. There's a lot of chatting, a lot of noise, an inevitable smart aleck sort of jokester who's going to use the opportunity to show everybody what a fun-loving bro he is and how lucky the other family is to have such a joker being married into it, and what fun he's going to be at Christmas parties going forward. It's nothing more tedious. So getting people into lines is the first order of the day. And once you've got people where you need them to be, things can sometimes go a little bit more smoothly. You're not going to be marrying the bride to the best man, for instance, because everybody is going to be in the place that they're supposed to be. You've got to show people how to hold hands for the vows. You've got to show them how to put on rings. You've got to show them how to kneel down and get up again, because it's not something that they're used to doing unless they're opera singers or priests. Unless, well, that's a different point. This is advice I give to any priest who is in formation. Don't go to the rehearsal dinner unless you really know the couple extremely well. Because you're going to be sat next, if you're the priest, you're going to be sat next to some grandma or granddad who, in my case, either doesn't speak French or doesn't speak English, and I have to do all the translation of the stupid talks about how the groom had his boxer shorts fixed to some flagpole somewhere when he was at college. to some lady who's just flown in from I don't know, what's that posh suburb of Paris towards the Neuilly? Yes, a Neuilly grandma in matching Clucci shoes and Chanel outfit. And she says, "Mais pourquoi est-ce que tout le monde est en train de rire, hein, monsieur le curé?" And you have to explain that it's to do with underwear. Well, I don't think we have time for this next little topic, really, which is the blessing of same-gender people. But what I can show you... Whoops. Well, there we go. It's a little magnifier. That wasn't meant to happen, and I don't know how to stop it. There. I can show you... I'll just end this for 1 second, and we'll come back to it. I need to get into this, and I need to get into this. As you can see, 13068, the resolutions of General Convention of the Episcopal Church, and the evolution of the liturgy from the witnessing and blessing of a lifelong covenant of same-gender people, and coming through, as we scroll down here, the vows and prayers are very different. Marriage is not mentioned in this particular liturgy. The prayers, therefore, don't recommend the witnessing and blessing of a marriage that has already taken place in a registry office. And finally, at the bottom here of this little screen, I'm sorry to be scrolling and scrolling, the celebration and blessing of a marriage. This is the celebration and blessing of a marriage of same-sex couples. And we can see here the very slight changes that have been made. The joining of two people in a life of mutual fidelity instead of the joining of a man and a woman in holy matrimony. So you can see that the words have been slightly changed to reflect this, the fact that we're dealing with two people of the same gender. But as we look down here, the declaration of consent, will you have this woman, this man, this person to be your wife, your husband, your spouse? You choose the word that the people want here, and you use that word within the ceremony. Now, we have begun to see, as we've looked at weddings in the context of liturgy, what a liturgy for a wedding is about. We've begun to see that there's a liturgical argument as well as a sort of theological argument or a biblical argument or a social justice argument for the blessing or marriage of same-gender people. Why is that? In our culture, and in many cultures, a man and a woman have often entered into marriage just saying, well, we're in love, and that's it, so therefore we should get married, because society expects that that's what people in love do. Or because it's the right thing to do, because of all my friends are getting married just at the moment and I'm feeling a little bit left out. Or we're going to Vegas, or we're eloping, or something. Rather than because they've really carefully thought out the ramifications of their decision to make vows to each other in a very specific Christian liturgical context. So some of the aspects of a wedding that the liturgy of a wedding service highlights are not actually gender specific, not at all. First of all, a commitment to love each other as God loves all God's people. What's gender specific about that? Secondly, commitment to care for each other no matter what happens, in sickness and in health, for richer, for poorer, as Christ cares for his body, the church. Nothing gender specific about that. Commitment to make the relationship that not something that refers only to itself, but to our neighbour, to our fellow pilgrims, in a creative and inclusive and regenerative way. That's not gender specific either. So it was less hard than you might think to take the traditional marriage service of the Episcopal Church and to make it non-gender specific. That still leaves the question that we raised at the beginning: should churches be involved in marriages at all? Why aren't there wedding ceremonies that reflect some of the more complicated marital relationships that we find in the Bible? That's a different question. But if we understood as a church that the wedding of two people, man and a woman, and a man and a man, should take place, there is no reason why we can't use the same ceremony in each case, because it's based on what we've just been looking at. Doesn't have to be gender specific. So let's look quickly at what can go wrong, because what can go wrong sometimes tells us a little bit more about the potentialities of these liturgies than we might think. Wedding liturgies are complicated, as I've said, and this isn't just because of where people are supposed to stand. It's because what the liturgy has got to do is control people's expectations. And nothing reveals the gap between what people imagine and what's actually possible, liturgically speaking, than a wedding does. People have all sorts of ideas about what they want their wedding to look like. Probably more women than men, I dare bet, perhaps, although that might not be right. And many men that I've talked to of preparing for the wedding have got their ideas too about what they want to happen, or sometimes they just say whatever she says, or whatever her mother says, more likely. So here's the thing, and it's important to mention this in the context of a wedding. Liturgy is not fantasy. It might have fantastical elements to it sometimes, but a liturgy is not a show. And it's not an occasion to show off those were just a couple of pictures of same-gender weddings. Here you can see the Episcopal flag here in the background. I think this was in Iowa or somewhere. I think it's Pete Buttigieg. Is it?
I don't know.
It could be. I think it looks like him, doesn't it, on the left here? And here is one that happened at Saint-Esprit several years ago. She was very, very nervous. She couldn't have been prouder. So, weddings are not occasions to show off how tasteful or how rich you are or how much you can spend. What liturgies are supposed to do, and weddings are interesting to show this, they're supposed to highlight the things that are important, the things that are significant, literally significant, poetically significant, figuratively significant. How does the liturgy highlight those things in a wedding? Nothing is going to be there simply to impose itself on the proceedings, whether it's laser lights or massive flower arrangements or whatever. You see, what is beautiful needs to be significant, and what's significant needs to be beautiful. That's what we're aiming for in a liturgy. We looked at this picture before, didn't we, when we talked about flowers, and we suddenly discovered here that the flowers look more important than the bride. She's going to disappear there if she's wearing white. She'll be like a chameleon that disappears into the background. So actually what's happened here is that the flowers are more significant than the bride's dress or something, or how the bride is going to be paraded up the altar. Here's a few more things that can go wrong where fantasies meet reality. Somebody is determined to look their very, very, very best, and they won't leave the house or the hotel until that happens. So what have you got? You've got a bride, normally, that arrives half an hour late. You have 3 weddings to do on that particular day, and they're booked an hour back to back. That's happened to me several times in the first parish that I was in. I would tell people very clearly, if you arrive 10 minutes late, I'm dropping a hymn. If you arrive 15 minutes late, we're not having the bridal procession down the aisle. You will come through the side door and step at the front because it will take too long. You respect the liturgical time. You do not respect the time that it takes your hairdresser to get your hair perfect. I know this sounds really strict and awful, and you know, I have made allowances before, but it's worth bearing all of these things in mind. Late arrivals can ruin a wedding for all sorts of reasons. Secondly, people have the most peculiar ideas that involve livestock, animals. One of the first weddings I ever did, the bride-to-be said that she'd had a little think about the bridesmaid and she would like a monkey that she was sponsoring at the local zoo. She was sponsoring the feed. And she said, well, we've got some lovely matching dresses, so she will look like all of the other bridesmaids. And I thought, well, you must have chosen some interesting bridesmaids in that case. And I said to her, listen, Lisa, this is your big day, and if you have a monkey coming down the aisle, nobody is going to be looking at you. They're going to be looking at the monkey. If that's what you want, I'm quite happy to do it. And she said, oh yes, I hadn't thought about that. Maybe the monkey could stay outside. So once again, we've got a sort of fantasy that is getting in the way. Another thing that can happen is that people have these bizarre ideas about what they're going to carry down the aisle. I had one wedding where she wanted to carry a parasol and a bird cage and wear gloves. Where she'd got this idea from, I don't know. But liturgically speaking, you're going to have to do some complicated stuff up there. You're going to have to be holding different hands and putting rings on and swapping places and doing... What are you going to do with all of these props in the meantime? How many bridesmaids have you got that are going to be able to take them off your hands? There was another spectacular occasion, I have to say, when a bride had been measured up for a wedding dress, and what she wanted was a wedding dress that was completely sleeveless and had no straps over the shoulders. So she'd booked a series of sessions at the gym so that her triceps and biceps and laterals and everything else would really look spectacular in the dress. But unfortunately, she hadn't made all of the appointments with her trainer, and she didn't look as good as she wanted to. So she instructed the person who made the bouquet to put a 20-pound weight inside the bouquet, made out of lead, so that when she carried it down the aisle, her muscles would pop because she was carrying something heavy. She omitted to tell me and omitted to tell the bridesmaid. She turned to hand the bouquet to the bridesmaid, who promptly dropped it on her foot because she wasn't expecting it to be that heavy. So once again, you've got to bear all of this stuff in mind if you're putting a liturgy together and not give way to some of these fantasies. Another thing that can happen, unfortunately, is that people want a wedding in a spectacular spot, you know, by a little lake or something. Apparently this video was fake. Everybody thought it was real at the time. But the minister here, this is the best man. It's always the best man that is supposed to mess things up. The best man was supposed to be coming up to give the ring to the groom, tripped over the dais here. Right behind here, there's a pond. The best man fell onto the bride, who tipped over backwards into the pond. The minister tried to rescue her and was dragged in, and he tried to rescue the minister, and the groom was dragged into the pond as well. Now, these things can happen, but for the sake of having a wedding in a spectacular spot, you've got to make sure that all trip hazards and everything else have been removed. Another thing that can happen is that people want to release things at weddings, like balloons, or on one particular occasion, it was butterflies. The butterflies were delivered in a little box, but they were all individually wrapped and on a slight chilling block, so they were all asleep. So they had to be ripped out of their little containers one by one, and they wouldn't fly because they were asleep. It was cruel. I wasn't told that this was going to happen beforehand, but I certainly would not permit it in the future. It was a bad idea. I said earlier on that you've got to teach people how to kneel down and stand up. If the groom kneels on the bride's dress and the bride tries to get up first, a catastrophe can happen and the bride's dress rips. If the groom's suit doesn't fit and he's not used to kneeling down and standing up, the flies can come down in the groom's suit. This happened at a wedding I was doing once. He turned round and somebody in the choir shouted out, "By gum, she's a quick worker," which caused a great deal of hilarity, and he ended up carrying the bouquet down the aisle because he couldn't zip it up again. His zip had broken irreparably. I'm using the wrong thing. Finally, you can lose a ring so easily. These things are small, they're delicate, everybody is nervous, they have to be transferred from the Labrador or the 4-year-old kid who doesn't want to be doing the job, carrying a cushion down the aisle, to the best man. The best man has to place them on the book that you're using to bless the rings, the prayer book, and sometimes they can drop off the book onto the floor. And if you're in a complicated church, as you can see here, with a heating grill, the ring can easily disappear down here and you need a contractor to get it out because the whole thing is soldered down. Here, this is exactly what happened at a Scottish wedding. Not a good thing to happen if you're wearing a kilt, presumably, if you have to scrabble around on the floor to find the lost ring, for obvious reasons. At least the family jewels are facing in the direction of the bride. Let's just put it discreetly that way. The minister looks vaguely amused. So you can see, the reason I've gone into this detail is to say that people's fantasies are not what a liturgy is supposed to be about. The simpler, the better, very often. Certain things have to happen, and if those things are complicated or fiddly, what you've got to do is to make sure they go as smoothly as possible so that their liturgical significance is understood rather than their value as dramatic moments in the service. Each thing is deliberate, careful, beautiful, poetical, fantastic occasionally. But it all has to be arranged around those principles when you're putting a liturgy together, especially a liturgy that can go as wrong for so many reasons as a wedding ceremony. And that applies to all liturgies, no matter what they are. But whether you're doing it for the Easter Vigil or a morning or evening prayer, it's one short step from the sublime to the ridiculous. And that is a motto I would embroider on a church cushion. Well, thank you, everybody. That's about it for tonight. It's lovely to see people following us too afterwards, not just on the Wednesday evenings, but following us on the YouTube channel. If you have any questions or comments about what we're doing, just write them in the comment section below. We'll be very, very happy to reply. Thanks again. I'm trying to find a picture that it's suitable to end on.
This one is perfect.
This one? She looks like she's having much more fun than the other bridesmaids probably did. So Joyce, would you like to finish with a prayer for us?
Nous t'en supplions, Seigneur, visite cette demeure et repousse loin d'elle toutes les embûches de l'ennemi. Que tes saints anges y habitent pour nous garder dans la paix et que ta bénédiction soit toujours sur nous. Par Jésus le Christ, notre Seigneur. Amen.